Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Kate Hudson. Kate is a political activist and academic. She is the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or CND, the former National Secretary and currently a National Officer of Left Unity, the radical left party in the UK, and an officer of the Stop the War Coalition. She is also the former Head of Social and Policy Studies at London South Bank University, and she is the author of numerous books, including CND at 60, Britain's Most Enduring Mass Movement, and The New European Left, A Socialism for the 21st Century. Kate, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So first, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you became involved with CND.
Well, like many people of my kind of age, in the 1980s, we were very, very concerned about the plans by the United States to situate a new tranche of nuclear weapons into Western Europe. These were the Polaris and cruise missiles. And basically, everybody knew that this would result in any potential nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union being fought in Europe. So, of course, we all thought we were going to die. And there was a massive upsurge in the anti-nuclear movement. There were all little campaign groups from virtually every town and even villages across the country, so-and-so town against the missiles, because we knew that we had to stop them coming to Britain. So, like many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of others, I became involved in the anti-nuclear movement. I went to Greenham, famous for its women's peace camp. I went on big marches and so on. So that was the first time I got involved. Towards the end of the 1980s, there was a treaty was signed to get rid of these nuclear weapons between the US and the Soviet Union. And like a lot of other people, I thought, okay, the problem's gone away. Of course, later on, after the end of the Cold War, we realized the problem hadn't gone away. We weren't entering into a lovely world of peace and harmony. We were entering into a kind of single superpower reality with the US kind of on the up and up. And I think during the 1990s, it became clear that NATO was expanding. It was moving to fill the space vacated by its previous rival. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved, but NATO wasn't. So I could see the world was actually becoming a much more dangerous place. So it was at that time, in the late 1990s, that I began to get involved with CND and the peace movement all over again. So, well, I haven't looked back since that time, I suppose.
Thank you. And following on from this, could you tell us a bit more about the CND itself? Including how and why it was founded and some of the key points in its history leading up to the present time.
Yes, CND was founded in 1958. It was in response to Britain getting nuclear weapons. We started to develop them very rapidly after the Second World War, but then into the 1950s, we started developing hydrogen bombs, many, many hundreds, if not thousands of times the power of the Hiroshima bomb and so on. So it was a result of that, but it wasn't only the possession of the bombs that was of concern to people. It was actually primarily at that time the concern that people had about nuclear weapons testing. And what was happening was that hundreds of nuclear weapons, again, hundreds of times the size of the Hiroshima bomb, were being tested in the atmosphere. And there was scientific evidence to show kind of cancer clusters and all sorts of things taking place as a result of all this radiation going around in the atmosphere. And women actually organized particularly strongly because they were very concerned about the impact of strontium-90, which was a kind of byproduct of weapons testing, getting into the food chain, affecting milk, and then having a very serious impact on infants, of course, who are particularly susceptible. So the forerunners of CND very often were women's groups. And then when CND was founded in 58, all the different campaigns and groups came into CND. And from 58 to the early 60s was, let's say, the first high point of CND. And we had the marches from London to Aldermaston and from Aldermaston to London and so on, which is the base near Reading, where Britain's nuclear weapons are made. So that there was a big upsurge then. And it was a kind of also, it's been described as the first radical social movement as well, because people from all walks of life got involved on a mass basis, and all kinds of other issues were raised in the course of the protest. So very positive and dynamic thing. And actually, it ended up in, I think it was 1963, with a massive achievement, which was that the international treaty for the partial test ban treaty, so to ban atmospheric nuclear tests, that was achieved. So they went underground, but they weren't any longer being exploded and tested in the atmosphere. So that was a big achievement. And then into the 60s and early 70s, the movement was still there. It was still active against Britain developing nuclear weapons, getting missiles and stuff from the US. But because of the Vietnam War going on at the same time, the peace movement was very involved in that as well. So I suppose the next high point of the specifically anti-nuclear stuff was the 1980s, where I talked about the anti-cruise missile campaigning. But just prior to that, there was another success. I'm just going to highlight a couple of successes, because sometimes people say, CND is not very successful, is it? You've been around for over 60 years, we've still got nukes. But in the late 1970s, the Americans tried to introduce another type of nuclear weaponry into Europe, known as the neutron bomb. And this was actually described at the time as the most effective capitalist bomb, because it didn't actually blow up and destroy property. It just killed people through radiation. So there was a big campaign at that time to prevent the neutron bomb, and that was successful. The US withdrew their plans to impose the neutron bombs on Western Europe. So that was very good. 80s, talked about that, a big highlight. And then I think, again, the kind of third wave began at the start of this century with the Bush's so-called war on terror, Blair, the Labour government at that time, with its dodgy dossier taking us into the war on Iraq and so on. So all that kind of development, big surge in membership then, of course, because we were taken into that war on the grounds that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and all that. Well, we said, well, actually, the weapons inspectors have found nothing of that sort. We have them here. We have nuclear weapons here. Since then, there was a strong surge. And of course, then when our government decided to replace Britain's nuclear weapons system, Trident replacement, there's big mobilization against that. And of course, most recently, earlier this year, the Boris Johnson's government announced the decision to overturn 3 decades of gradual reductions and increase Britain's nuclear arsenal. So we've seen an increase in membership and support this year for that very reason.
And as you alluded to a little bit, the CND has a number of campaigns that emphasize links between both nuclear weapons as well as nuclear energy and other issues globally. One such campaign is the Climate Not Trident campaign, which looks at climate change and nuclear war and nuclear energy as interconnected issues. Can you talk a little bit about interconnection and the campaign of the CND?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if your viewers are aware that every year the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in the United States, the top nuclear physicists, they announce how close we are to the destruction.
The doomsday clock.
The doomsday clock, yeah. So every year we pay very close attention to this, and for some while it had been kind of moving away from midnight, which is destruction, but over recent years, and particularly during the Trump period, the hands got closer and closer, and now for 2 years in a row we've been 100 seconds to midnight. And that's the closest it's ever been. Even during the Cold War, it was never that close. So that's quite extraordinary. And the scientists, when they came to this conclusion, they said there are 2 great existential threats. nuclear war and climate change. And that's exactly how we understand it. And we know that, well, we all have to work to bring climate change and nuclear weapons to an end, but we know that the carbon footprint, let's say, or boot print, as some people call it, of the nuclear weapons sector, that industrial structure, is very, very high. And of course, the military, the carbon footprint of the military globally is enormous as well. And we know, we've heard that when calculations are made about where carbon comes from, apparently they tend to leave the military out of the calculations. So it kind of obscures the fact that CO2 is, you know, very strongly comes from the military and from the nuclear weapons sector. So we're very, very keen to expose that and to campaign against that. And also, you mentioned nuclear energy, of course. We are opposed to nuclear energy. Unfortunately, some people have the misunderstanding that nuclear energy is carbon neutral, which of course it isn't. The final production process is pretty clean, but you have to take into account the whole mining of uranium and all that kind of thing, which is a very, very dirty process, and all the building of the power stations. So it's certainly not carbon neutral, and we strongly oppose it. And we say there are so many renewable energy sources now. It's proven that all our needs could be met from renewable energies. You can now store renewable energy and so on. We need to get away from this addiction to nuclear and go for clean energy and just eradicate the nuclear weapons sector, which is so destructive on so many levels.
Absolutely. And the CND also has an anti-war campaign. And as I mentioned before, you yourself have long worked together with the Stop the War Coalition. Can you talk about how you view the relationship between nuclear weapons and warfare in general, as well as how this connects to the anti-war movement, as you were discussing a bit before historically, as well as the issue of the global arms trade?
Well, yes, complex question there. So first of all, we are primarily an anti-nuclear weapons movement. That's our raison d'etre. As you rightly say, we do take on anti-war issues at certain times. And we're not, like some anti-war movements, we're not just opposed to all, we don't campaign against all wars at all times, because that's not our function. But what we do have in our strategic objectives is opposition to and prevention of wars in which nuclear weapons may be used. So our anti-war stance is very much along those lines, but also in addition, other weapons of mass destruction. Okay, so chemical and biological weapons, for example. So we've worked to highlight, for example, the use of chemical weapons in Turkey, for example, in Syria, but also in Palestine as well. We know that white phosphorus has been used, for example, by the Turkish government, by the Israeli government, and so on, in what are war crimes. So we highlight the humanitarian consequences of the use of those terrible forms of weaponry. And for that reason, of course, we also very strongly support the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which attempts to ban nuclear weapons globally in the same way that chemical and biological weapons have been banned, landmines, cluster munitions, and so on. So that's a very strong part of our anti-war campaigning. But any wars where it's likely that nuclear weapons could be used, we stand up against them. So, for example, against the Iraq war, we also strongly oppose the drive to war on Iran, which pops up occasionally. You know, it's in abeyance at the moment, but certainly during the Bush presidency, we saw that. So we worked to link our anti-nuclear campaigning to the anti-war struggle, because we know that although nuclear weapons are very often used as a kind of a political threat or a means of kind of terrorizing through power and so on, we do also know that they are weapons and they have been used in war. You know, twice in 1945 against a country which didn't have nuclear weapons. So we know that they can be used in war. We know there is increasing talk about usable nuclear weapons, and that was one of the things that President Trump did in his last year of office. He talked about, not only talked about getting usable, so-called usable nuclear weapons, you know, supposedly smaller nuclear weapons, he also manufactured them and deployed them. You know, so this is the kind of situation we're in. So we're very concerned to make people understand the risks and that nuclear weapons are there. They can be used not only as a political weapon, but can and will be used in warfare if we're not vigilant and we don't campaign to expose that and to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Mm. And another campaign of the CND is the anti-NATO campaign. And we discussed a little bit about NATO before, especially in its expansion in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Can you talk a bit about the CND's anti-NATO campaign, about why the CND opposes NATO, as well as your thoughts about the ways that NATO can be challenged today as this large international military alliance, and how we might move beyond NATO?
Absolutely. Well, yes, you're right. It's one of our strategic priorities. Mostly, I think, because it is a nuclear-armed military alliance. In fact, some of our members say that NATO stands for Nuclear Armed Terrorist Organization. But I mean, the problem is that, or one of the many problems about NATO and their nuclear stuff, is that they actually have a first use policy. In other words, they would be prepared to use nuclear weapons, not just in retaliation, which would obviously be bad enough and illegal and everything, but they would use them first. In fact, this has a direct bearing on Britain, because when we've campaigned in the past and we've written to defence secretaries and so on and said, can you consider Britain adopting a no first use policy, which China and India both have no first use policies. They say, well, no, we can't do that. Even if we wanted to, we can't, because our nuclear weapons are part of NATO and NATO has a first use policy. So it's that's a disastrous thing, and there are no circumstances under international law or anything, it's absolutely clear in the United Nations law, it would be completely illegal under any circumstances to use nuclear weapons first, and also illegal to retaliate as well, because of the massive loss of life as a result of that. So that's a bad thing about NATO and its nuclear policy. So our nuclear weapons are assigned to NATO. There's the big US arsenal there as well. And there are also, which is very controversial in Europe, there are about 150 US nuclear weapons in Europe, not part of any national arsenal, but they're sort of US/NATO weapons across a number of countries in Europe, including Turkey, by the way. And in many countries, the countries do not want to have these nuclear weapons there. So in Belgium, for example, and some other West European countries, the parliaments of those countries have voted that they should be got rid of. And America says, no, sorry, we can't remove them, because NATO operates on a consensus basis, so everyone has to agree. And there are countries in Europe who want to have US nukes in Europe. So these poor countries, supposed to be sovereign states, have these nuclear weapons imposed upon them. So that's another reason why NATO is such a problem. But on the wider sphere, you mentioned about the expansion, the kind of geographical expansion of NATO, running parallel to those waves of NATO expansion since 1989. We've also seen waves of expansion of the kind of remit of NATO, because originally it was supposed to be a defensive alliance of the member states. So they would all get together, and if one of them was attacked, they would fight back together. Okay, that's one thing. But in 1999, when they were incorporating the first tranche of former state socialist countries of Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, when they were being incorporated, they also announced a new mission statement, which said that NATO would now engage in out-of-area activities. In other words, they would go and do stuff elsewhere. So the kind of defence thing, that was no longer the thing. And only a few years later, NATO was heavily involved in the war on Afghanistan, and then from 2003 it was responsible for the whole military operation in Afghanistan. So it went from, people say, well, what's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization doing in Afghanistan? Well, good question. And basically, it's explained by the fact that NATO now has a global policy. NATO has gone global, and it's not just being in Afghanistan, it's also Colombia, for example, in Latin America. That's a partner organization of NATO. They're making all these alliances with different countries in Southeast Asia, Australasia, and so on, because their new target is China, building up resources and forces and so on against China. So it's like it's gone from Western Europe and North America global, and that's the situation, that's the danger, and that's why we are so opposed to it. It's taking that nuclear threat global.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And if you could say a little bit about how you think NATO can be effectively challenged today at this point, given its expanse and remit.
Well, very difficult. Yeah. One of the things that we very strongly feel is that this is not just a UK problem. This is a global problem. It's an international problem, as are many of the problems we face, like climate change, for example. So we have to fight it internationally. So CND is part of the international No to War, No to NATO network. So it works, it's European based originally, but it now includes representatives from big organizations in the United States and elsewhere internationally. And we organize together, we put on events together. So for example, every time there's a NATO heads of state summit, we have a counter summit. This year, when it was in Brussels in June, we had to do that online, or primarily online, but normally we meet together, we have a demonstration, conference, and to develop common strategies. So big demonstrations and counter summits, strategic development, planning, actions at the different bases, and also attempting to raise awareness of what NATO actually means, because one of the things that NATO has done in recent years is to try and portray itself as a kind of human rights or humanitarian support organization, and that they don't talk about military interventions. They talk about going in to help the population and defend them, and take food aid and all this sort of thing. So you'd think that they were they've attempted to rebrand themselves as some kind of nice kind thing that helps the world and brings democracy. And that was a very strong messaging that came from the recent summit in Brussels, that attempt to portray NATO in that way.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned very briefly before Turkey. I would like to ask you about Turkey a bit more. As you mentioned, there are a number of nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey from the United States, which have been there since the 1960s, many of them due in large part to its geostrategic location.
Mhm.
And in this context, and more broadly, how do you view the significance of Turkey to the NATO alliance?
Mm.
And additionally, we were speaking before about the relationship between conventional forms of warfare and nuclear
Mm.
weapons. How does Turkey's more recent aggression and wars in the region interact with the CND's work on the anti-war campaign?
Mm. Yes, absolutely. So for NATO, clearly Turkey is an important component part, because primarily, as we've already discussed, NATO is primarily it's been Western Europe, it's been North America, US and Canada and so on. So having Turkey as part of that, which was in the Middle East, relatively close proximity to former Soviet Union, to the oil-rich countries of the Middle East and so on. As you say, an important geostrategic role. And so in spite of criticisms periodically about Turkey's human rights record, for example, they have stuck with NATO, with Turkey in NATO. And of course, with the recent expansion into Eastern Europe and so on, Turkey's now kind of no longer isolated from the rest. There's a kind of continuity across the European continent now and into the Middle East. So it's very important for NATO. And of course, that does raise issues, particularly because of the human rights record of Turkey. And in fact, one of the things that was noticeable at the recent NATO summit, when they were talking, they issued a communique and they were talking about the values of NATO, like democracy, freedom, support for human rights, and all this kind of thing, as though, that's that kind of organization rather than a military, aggressive military bloc. And not only that that's what they stand for, but that's what they guarantee for their citizens, the citizens within the NATO states. Well, who is going to say, really and truthfully, that Turkey goes along with and upholds the supposed values of NATO? I mean, that just does not bear scrutiny, because we know there are very substantial human rights abuses, infringements of democracy and so on within Turkey. So that's a significant problem, and it's something that is a kind of an Achilles heel for NATO, and it's a very, very serious matter. With regard to the weaponry used, which I touched on earlier on, we know that Turkey uses these weapons, chemical weapons in particular, against the Kurdish community, for example. And these are very, very serious crimes, and it's something that CND has raised in its campaigning, in the same way that we raise the use of white phosphorus and other chemical weaponry by Israel against the Palestinian people, in contradiction to their rights, the rights of the Palestinians to their own state, as enshrined in UN resolutions and so on. So these are very serious matters. And CND is very concerned about this weaponry. We're also concerned with our government's record, of course, on arms sales, which is very, very problematic. Huge amounts of money is made by Britain on this. And of course, the example which many people point to now is the fact that Britain sells arms to Saudi Arabia for use in its war on the people of Yemen. And of course, we know what a humanitarian catastrophe that is, particularly for the children of Yemen. So the British government has very dirty hands, and we have to do everything that we can to raise awareness of it.
Absolutely. And finally, I want to ask you about self-determination. So we've been speaking about the global powers, chiefly the NATO alliance, represent impediments at this stage to really any region or people seeking to achieve self-determination today in the manner in which they impose their agenda at a global level, in large part due to their military power backed by nuclear armaments. So in this context, how do you think that a complete and effective ban on nuclear weapons, the dismantling of nuclear armaments, would affect the issue of self-determination and shift the global balance of powers?
Mm. Yeah, very, very important question. So thinking about self-determination, of course, the greatest crime against self-determination was, of course, the colonial expansion of primarily West European countries during the 18th and 19th and into the 20th centuries, and the terrible catastrophe that they unleashed on so many communities and so many populations. And of course, one of the lasting impacts, of course, has been the way in which the colonial powers drew the maps of the areas that they occupied and brutalized, with no real concern for the communities that lived there, the nationalities and peoples that lived there. These arbitrary lines were drawn, I mean, at the end of the First World War, for example. So that's the kind of, the kind of failure to respect not only human rights, but the right of peoples to self-determination is a very strong part of the colonial legacy. And NATO, in its way, being the kind of alliance of the rich and powerful, many former colonial countries are in there, they still have those colonial mindsets. I mean, thinking of European empires, particularly, say, the British and French empires. And we've seen how they recently acted, for example, in their war on Libya. When the US was pulling back from that under Obama, we saw how they acted then. So that is a kind of continuity of disgraceful colonial mentalities and brutalization and the stamping on the rights of ordinary people, wherever they are located. So that is to be fought. And what we don't want to see is other powers, external powers, saying they know what is right for a country, they know what political or economic system that country should have. People must decide for themselves. And I think that's a kind of a fundamental principle that we very, very strongly support. In terms of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, I think, which came into force at the UN in January of this year, one of the most interesting things about that is that it has been led by the countries of the global south. Okay, this is not something that's come from the rich and wealthy countries because they're busily in NATO or nuclear armed alliances, or they have their own nuclear weapons. They're against this treaty because this is a treaty that would liberate the world from all the terrible things about nuclear weapons. It would liberate the world from that terrible power imbalance between the haves and the have-nots in nuclear terms. This is a marvellous thing. And all the countries pretty much that are signing up, I mean, there are one or two European countries that have signed up, but primarily, as I say, it's led by the global south. And those countries, most of them, are already self-organized into nuclear weapons-free zones. This is something that's not widely known about, but I think virtually the entire global south and some of the global north in Asia is already organized, self-organized into these nuclear weapons-free zones. So that is what the majority of the world want. And we are in this terrible situation where a very small, very powerful minority are imposing these nuclear weapons. And collectively, we, the peoples of the world, must overturn that.
Mm-hmm. Complete agreement. These are, of course, very complex issues, and we could say much more about them, but I think, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. Are there any final thoughts you would like to leave us with in closing?
Well, only that people are very welcome to join CND, or if you don't have time to join, if you go to our website, there are many online actions that you can take part in. So, for example, what we're doing at the moment is we are reporting the UK to the UN for breaking international law by increasing its nuclear arsenal. So you can just go on the website and sign up to that online, and that would be a great help.
Perfect. And we will provide a link to your website along with this video.
Thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.